So for this week, we're just going to start working through configuring the initial firewall configurations and settings. So we'll get initial access to that. We'll configure the management network and settings, and we'll activate the firewall and manage licenses, etc. So we're going to go through a little bit of that. When we initially access a firewall, if it's a physical firewall, we have a dedicated out-of-band management Ethernet port, such as what you see here. We also can connect through a console port. We have that same thing available through the virtual machine, where you can connect to it through a dedicated NIC interface, which is considered that out-of-band management network, or you could go even through the serial terminal side. In this case, you would have a console access that you could go to. The default IP address for most firewall models is 192.168.1.1 on a /24. For the virtual machine series firewalls, it's a DHCP client. So it's going to automatically try to pull an IP address for its internal side. In the case of your lab environment, you're going to see it as 192.168.1.254, I believe. By default, the username and password is admin and admin. For your lab environment, we'll go through. The username will be admin. The password would be Palo Alto. And there's a special case spelling of doing that. All right. This here's what you would typically see when you log into the administrative access for a virtual machine. So you'll see this up here at the top. You have a dashboard and all the different main tabs up across here. And then you're going to have a series of tabs that usually go down the left-hand side once you go into one of these upper tabs. This will be the main dashboard. This is where you can check to make sure everything's up and running. You'll primarily do things within the network and the device tab, and then obviously policies and objects as we get further into the semester. If we go through, sorry about that, mouse is getting a little tricky today. If we look at the lower left-hand side, this is what it would look like through the SSH or even the console CLI. It's going to look very similar to what you have done with Cisco devices and will functionally operate very closely to what a Cisco device would do in terms of command structure. It's a little bit different, but it's very similar. If you were to be using the panorama interface, that's what that would look like up here. Note that it's very similar to what you would see through the direct dashboard. We won't be using panorama in this class. That's kind of the class after this one, so to speak, in terms of Palo Alto Academy. And then last but not least, you can configure the device using a REST or an XML API, in which you can send certain commands out and gather information back from that. So when you first log into Palo Alto, you're going to get this predefined admin password. Remember, it's admin for the initial login. Then after that, it's going to force you to change it right off the bat. There are some predefined admin password complexities where it's going to require a minimum of 8 characters, an uppercase, a lowercase, and some kind of special character or numeral. You'll notice this yellow in the background. This is what happened with Palo Alto 10. So if you are ever using a firewall that was blue or white, that's going to be more of one of the older versions of Palo Alto. Newer ones are all yellow. All right, these requirements, they cannot be changed and they are not applied to other administrator accounts. You can define other user accounts and give them administrator privileges, but the core admin one must meet at least these minimum requirements. Must be somebody online. All right, to reset to factory default configurations, from the CLI, which is pretty common, about the only way you're going to get in with the console is to request a system private data reset. That's going to erase all the logs, all the settings, IP addressing, which will result in any kind of loss of connectivity, and it will save that default configuration to the management IP address once it's changed. Okay. During boot up, if you have an unknown admin user from the console port, you can type in mate during the boot up process. You can then choose to restore or reset to factory default, and then you can load a previous configuration file if the admin password is changed or is invalid. All right. Very handy if you end up purchasing one or ever getting your hands on one. It's nice to know how to factory reset it, get it back to scratch so that you can start utilizing it. All right. Within the main web interface, like I mentioned at the top, these are going to be your functional category tabs. You'll want to click on one of these first. The labs will typically walk you through that. In the lower left-hand corner is your logout button. On the lower right-hand corner, you're going to see all of your tasks. Every time you make changes or after a series of changes, you'll hit that commit button in the upper right. This is not a live interface. So if you're used to, say, a Cisco router or switch, you type the command, hit enter, boom, it automatically takes it, right? Those changes are live. In this case, you can make a series of changes and then you can commit those changes. So they're not live until you actually commit them. This would allow you to set up a bunch of things during the day. And then if you are one of those that commits those at, say, midnight, when you're taking the system down for maintenance, you can then go ahead and commit those changes. It's a much better system to work with versus Cisco routers and switches. If you're not paying attention, you start typing in, hit enter, and then boom, your system can go down. I don't know how many times I broke it and done that to myself. There is a help portal in the upper right-hand corner. You can click that question mark and it'll get you some help on each one of the pages. When we're working with individual interfaces, there's generally going to be pop-ups that come up on the screen. At the top, you're going to see, again, a series of tabs, and then you'll have the fields that you'll fill out. Anything that has a red underline is required in order to be completed before you can hit the OK button. So notice that the OK button is grayed out down at the bottom until all of the red underlined stuff is filled out, or it'll do a red highlight on any kind of required fields. Once that's filled out, the OK button pops up. This kind of trips up students a lot. They're like, I don't understand why I can't click OK. It's because you forgot something somewhere. All right. So configuring the initial web interface when you come in, when they give you instructions like what you see up here at the top, device, setup, interfaces, and management, that means when you go back to this screen, you would click on device. Over here on the left-hand side, you would have setup. In the middle, you'll have a tab called management, and then you would set up the IP address. So that's the flow, and you'll get that as you start going through the labs. All right. For this particular one, we can either set it to a static or DHCP. Remember that by default, everything is set to static and can have an IP address of 192.168.1.1. Note that we are setting the management interface in this. So there's the firewall interface, which is 192.168.1.1. Then there is the management interface, which in this case is 192.168.1.254. That allows us to log into that management port without actually having connectivity on the 192.168.1.1 network, in theory, depending on if you put these on separate networks. All right. That management interface obviously can be either static or DHCP. It does require the minimum configuration of an IP address, a net mask, and a default gateway. And then last but not least, on the right-hand side, you can set an IP address block of what's permitted to access the administrative interface. If you don't set anything, obviously it leaves it open to everything. You want to lock this down as much as possible.
Management interface also this
No, it can be anything. It requires to have an IP, a net mask, and a gateway. And then you really want to try to set up permitted IP addresses over on the right-hand side. The less people that can even actually log to the user login screen is the less amount of people that can start either, doing brute force entry to try to figure out what the password is, that kind of stuff. You can eliminate all that by just setting that to your management network. So typically in an environment, like in your home, you have a 192.168.1.1 network, right? /24, you go to the router's IP, you can log into the web interface and go. In firewalls like this, you typically have what's called a management network. And this is a separate network that only has management access to all your devices. In other words, you won't be actually operating your laptop on, say, the user network and being able to access the firewall. Typically, you don't allow that type of access. Yes, it's nice when you're at your home, that's why you can do it. But when you're in a corporate environment, it's typically on a completely separate management network. And that can be, most times, physically wired separate. In other words, I take a data cable going to the management port on this, it goes to an entirely separate switch that is only for management access. Then if I'm a network administrator, when I VPN in, I have access to that management network, and then I can manage and configure everything. If I'm not VPN'd in, I just have user access, just like everybody else. All right. For example, when I set this up in the data center in Raleigh in North Carolina, We actually had an entirely separate 48-port switch that connected every single device in all of our racks. So that would be like switches. We would get the out-of-band management interface. They had those as well. The firewalls would have one, and then we would also have ones for all the servers. So all your iDRACs, typically, if you guys are familiar with server work, you have iDRACs like on Dell's or IPMI interfaces, which gives you network connectivity to the core of the server, not Windows or Linux or whatever you're running for an operating system, but the actual motherboard has its own connection now to the network. That way you can remotely log in, you can actually turn off the server and back on, you can reboot it, you can install remote operating systems, mount ISOs from across the network, basically let you manage the server without physically being there. And that's how I operated much of North Carolina. Was I was at home here in Hayes, and I would remotely log into every servers. I could wipe everything on them. I could reload a new OS, do everything remote. As long as they got me connectivity over there with the cable, I could use the management network. That's the purpose behind what you would see something with on a Palo Alto. All right, some other initial configuration settings. If we go out to device, setup and management, you're going to see the chance for us to set a host name. You'll also see a chance for us to do a domain of some sort. In this case, in your lab, it's going to be the panw.lab. You can set a login banner message. This is very similar to what you guys have seen on your Cisco routers and switches that you've done up to this class. You can force admins to even acknowledge that login banner, which means you can put, unauthorized access, not invalid, prosecution, etc. And then that forces somebody to click that, which means you then have legal ramifications if they do find a way into your system. Not that you didn't already, but they actually had to acknowledge that they were an admin, and therefore you can usually catch them up in court. Down here at the bottom, you can set up some SSL service profiles. We'll go through that a little bit more. You definitely want to make sure you set up your time zones and the accurate time. It is also nice to set up your latitude and longitude. The reason for that part is you can start mapping out your network and the connections that are coming into the network. The Palo Alto GUI actually has like an overview of the world, and then it can show where your firewall is located and where the connections are coming in. It traces back the IP address and does IP address lookup info so that I can actually tie that back to some kind of latitude, longitude. So it's nice to fill that information out. Makes it really handy with the maps that are built into Palo Alto. Then down at the bottom, you have a series of different options down there, primarily being able to set up things like tunnel acceleration and using the hypervisor assigned MAC address in a virtual machine. All right. Other important services to set up when you first get the firewall, you will want to make sure you set up your DNS services primarily because that's how you get updates. So you would go out here to the device, setup, and then services. Inside this tab on the DNS servers down below, you want to set up your primary DNS servers. Does anybody know what Quad 8s are? Google, right? Anybody know Google's alternative one?
Quad 4s.
Yep, all 4s are 4422, I think was another one back in the day. But yes, all Quad 8s is always going to be Google's DNS server. That's a great one for you as a cybersecurity / network engineer to know. That way you can bypass any local DNS requests and that kind of stuff. Now, firewalls can obviously reroute all DNS requests back to itself, but that's another thing that we're going to deal with later in this semester. You can set some timeout features down here, down below, and run those. Up here at the top, this update server is going to be important. So you can run updates.paloalto.networks.com. However, they do have like a beta one and an alpha one, and you can set up the different servers that you want to pull from. You will want to check this box for verifying update server identity. This is going to check based on SSL certificates, making sure that it's a valid certificate and somebody's not acting to be updates.paloalto.networks.com. The other tab at the top is NTP. It says NTP client configuration is optional, but recommended. I say it's absolutely required. And the reason for this is just like anything on your network right now, you guys have been configuring, again, routers and switches. When you get into firewalls, it's important for your log information to be accurate, which means you need network time protocol running on your network. It's usually recommended that you set up your own NTP server somewhere in the network. This could be your edge router, could be this firewall in and of itself. But the idea is that's going to pull something from a Stratum clock, such as the pool.ntp.org that you see down below. Once that's updated, then everything else in the network needs to point out to the firewall or needs to point out to your router, whatever you set up NTP on. The idea being that if you do that, don't point everything out to, say, pool.ntp.org, because you may be pulling at different times and it'll be out of sync. If you set it everything inside your network to one device, and then that one device out to the outside edge, all of your logs are going to line up. And when you guys are trying to do troubleshooting and cybersecurity stuff, you want your logs to be accurate. You don't want to chase a log on this device that says it's 9:03 and this device over here says it's 9:10, and another one is 6 hours off because you forgot to set the time zone and you're trying to figure out why that happened 6 hours ago. It sounds silly and easy, but trust me, if you've ever done any kind of log combinations to get everything together, it's a nightmare and you'll chase your tail for days. So NTP is always necessary. You definitely need DNS in order to reach the update servers. All right. Which, speaking of DNS servers, brings us to our service routes. So by default, that management port will need outside internet access, meaning that that management port needs some way to route out to the internet so that it can go get the updates from the servers, right? That's off of your network. It needs to be able to get out there. You do have the option of specifying one of your other Ethernet ports in order for that particular port to be the access route for a given service. So if you want all of your updates to go through your internet uplink, that is probably what you would want to reroute those external services through. More than likely, you don't have internet access on your management network. That defeats the purpose of the management network, right? It should be a sandbox network. So you would set up these service routes. You can set up different ones for update servers, DNS, NTP, whatever. You can set up different Ethernet interfaces for that. A lot of times you have a internal Ethernet, external Ethernet, DMZ Ethernet, and something else, right? And these devices have multiple Ethernet ports available to them. Let's see here. As Sam mentioned, if you've ever been in a Windows keybin, Windows admin, Kerberos is also very time-sensitive protocol. And if the local system time between a client and the server differs by more than 5 minutes, the client itself will not be able to authenticate. So that's another reason there again, if you guys set up Kerberos or you set up even Radius servers and TACAX servers, that kind of stuff for logins, if they're out of date or out of sync, it won't allow it to go through. So you really want to set up network time management on your entire network. I know they talk about it a little bit in CCNA 1, CCNA 2, but it's really, really important. Okay. To configure those service routes, you'll go to the device tab up at the top. You go out to setup, services, and then service route configuration. Down there, you can select what services you want to adjust. You can click on the set selected routes, and then you can tell it what interface you want it to go out of. So for example, in the lab network, the Ethernet 1.1 interface is basically the ISP uplink, and that is where you can connect to that. After you select the source interface first, it will then give you the source IP addresses based in the dropdowns. That's based on how you configure those interfaces. It's usually not something you type in. All right, last but not least, when you get a firewall up to date, there's a couple different ways to get licensing from Palo Alto. So if you're dealing with a hardware firewall, you need to go grab the serial number from the dashboard page. You guys remember that's the first page that pops up. You also have the option of retrieving license keys from the license server. You can do this by clicking activate. In a virtual machine based, usually they email you auth codes. And for example, that's what I have is a series of auth codes in order to enable all the services on the Palo Altos that we use in NetLab. I also have this activate feature for this auth code if you guys want to download a version of this VM50 on your laptop and be able to play with it at home. So if you guys want that, email me and I will get you this authorization code. I'll also get you the link to download the VM50. Those are good for 180 days. So if you guys plan on taking the CERT or something like that, you want your own dev environment, you can definitely set that up for this class. If you want to verify DNS servers, you come in here, you go and check up your services that you have. From there, you can get the latest updates and threat signatures. We're going to cover all this later in the course. And then last but not least, you can verify your operating system and install the recommended version. Palo Alto releases updates every day. Every single day do they have updates for the application and threat signatures. Operating systems typically go in major series, but there's a lot of those updates. What's nice is they'll give you the release notes, let you know every single thing that's changed, and then you can decide whether you're going to push to the new version or not. They let you keep up to, I believe it's 3 or 4 versions of the operating system on the device, so you could always roll back to an before operating system. Note that your configuration files may not always be backwards compatible. Okay. To do that, so again, you go out to device and then licenses. From there, you're going to see all the different services that the Palo Alto offers and how long they're, if they're expired or if you have a license for that. When you purchase things from Palo Alto, for example, the VM50, you buy the license for the actual the firewall itself. Then there is packages of these different services that you can buy individually, or you can buy the whole 9 yards kitchen sink package. It's not cheap. It can be anywhere from $1,500 a year up to $10,000 a year, depending on which system you're putting that on. So, and we're going to go through all these different services throughout this course. Down here at the bottom, again, you can go and activate those keys. So if you did something, particularly with a virtual machine, if you try to clone the virtual machine or do backups, it does not work. It will change the underlying it's basically an IEI type key that's underneath the hood. What's the word that I'm looking for? It's kind of a global key that'll be underneath. If you try to clone a virtual machine, it will cause problems. You have to do specific types of cloning in which that particular key doesn't change. That's what I have to do for NetLab. If you look over here on this side, you'll also have the ability to deactivate this virtual machine. If you need to bring up another one, or you can upgrade the VM capacity, meaning that you don't have to go to install a whole new device. You just assign a new key and you automatically get the new license, which is pretty slick. So I can jump from a VM50 up to a VM700 if I wanted to. For those Palo Alto software updates, you're going to see this in here, and we're going to play with a little bit of that in the lab. You can see the main versions over here on the left-hand side. You can see the release date, which one is currently installed. You have the options of downloading prior versions or even newer versions and clicking directly on the release notes to find out what changed. So it's really handy as an administrator. You don't have to go out to the website, go down through the release notes, figure out what changed. You can do that right within the main admin dashboard. All right. You can also not only download it, if you don't have internet access for that management port, you can go out to Palo Alto, grab the iOS or the PAN OS software, and then you can upload it directly here. That's useful if you haven't configured anything and you have a new system and you want to upload it off a USB drive. There is USB ports on physical firewalls, so you can upload it off a USB drive, or you can upload it over a network connection. When it comes to dynamic updates, these are going to be all your, not the Palo Alto software updates, but the actual service updates. So you guys will be dealing with the antivirus software, for example. You can tell that to schedule a check for, in this case, it checks every hour at 5 minutes past the hour, and it will download and automatically install. On the application and threats down below, every 30 minutes, at 10 minutes past the half hour, it will download and install. You can also set that to just download, where you actually have to do the install, etc. All depends on your business plan as a company and your guys' security plan as to how you want that to either automatically do updates or not. What's really nice on these, and we'll talk about this with application and threats, you typically want to go through and do the install yourself so that you can review the apps and make sure it doesn't break any of your policies. This will actually go through and check to see if updating to the newest version is going to break any of the policies that you configure. Lower left-hand side, you can check now, upload and install from a file manually if you don't have internet access. All right. So that should get you through the beginning of that. In the lab guides, anything in blue, things like that, are going to be very detailed steps. If you get over here to the gray side, these are going to be high level, just giving you an idea of what's going on. It says you can use one section or both, and most of these, you're going to get this detailed setup on NetLab, right? But practice with the labs. Be familiar with the interface, where it's going through. The way I set up NetLab, you can make reservations for up to 8 hours. You can have 8 extensions on top of that. Yeah, I mean, there's 20 pods on there, and there's only 20, maybe 20 people in this class. And that's only 1 pod per person if you use it every 24 hours of a day, 7 days a week, which isn't the case, right? So with 20 pods, I can literally service thousands of students. I do it all the time. All right. So again, within this first lab that you're going to go into, we are going to use our client virtual machine and connect out to the management port on our virtual machine. From there, we're going to go in and connect to that web interface, set up a lab configuration, set up the DNS, the NTP, the login banner, latitude, etc., and schedule those dynamic updates. All right. Let's go. All right, so for those that didn't cheat and see all the answers down below, what are the 2 attributes of a dedicated out-of-band management port in a Palo Alto Networks firewall? Is it A, labeled management by default, B, cannot be, let's move this out of the way, cannot be configured as a standard traffic port, C, supports only SSH connections, or D, requires a static non-DHCP network configuration?
A and B.
A and B?
Right.
That's correct. So the idea is that you cannot put standard traffic over that management port. It is an out-of-band management port, which means it does not have anything to do with the traffic going through the firewall. All right. And you have the ability to use DHCP. That's the only reason that D doesn't end up working down here. You can use static or you can use DHCP. All right. True or false, to register a hardware firewall, you will need to have a firewall serial number.
True.
True.
True for a hardware firewall, right? In a web interface, what is signified when a text box is highlighted in red? Either the value of the text box is optional, the value of the text box is required, there's an error, or it's controlled by Panorama.
Required.
Required, right? B. And then lastly, true or false, service routes can be used to configure an in-band port to access external services.
True.
True. Again, the purpose of that is if you don't have internet access available off the management port, then you can assign one of the in-band ports to perform the external services. For example, going out to get updates, DNS, things like that within the system. All right. Let's see here. So obviously we finished a little bit early today. In this case, it's obviously very short. Again, these are going to get progressively longer, and Tuesdays we're going to sometimes run out of time. It's just you guys are in the very beginning of working with it. So definitely go out and read and do the interactives and the configuration files. You'll have module 2 quiz out there on Palo Alto. If you haven't done module 1, make sure you go back and do that. Has anybody had any issues taking the quizzes? Okay, just want to make sure that's all working like it's supposed to. So we have 2 options since everybody's here. I'm going to pause this recording for now.